Very pleased to welcome Ethnicity Centre Director here at the University, Professor Tariq Modood, who is going to talk to us today in his talk about Islamophobia. And the talk will consider what Islamophobia is, why some people consider it a form of racism and others think of it as a form of religious discrimination, and raise the question of why, when the data shows there is more hostility to Muslims than any other group, except perhaps travellers, that Islamophobia is still relatively peripheral in anti-racism and diversity and inclusion initiatives. So a really important talk today, and thank you, Tariq, for being here. So Professor Tariq Modood.
Thank you, Lauren, and hi everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk, which is entitled, "Is there an Islamophobia problem?" Just trying to get I'm trying to move to the next slide. Here we go. Right. So there are four problems I'm going to talk about. Firstly, does it exist and how big is it? Secondly, what is it? Thirdly, why is there denial and marginality? Or, if you like, is there denial and marginality? And fourthly, distinguish Islamophobia from reasonable criticism. So this is a graph from the British Social Attitudes Survey of 2013, and it shows the percentage of white respondents who mind if a close relative marries an ethnic minority. And you can see there are a number of different groups on the table, on the graph. Of course, the striking point is that the number of white people who mind if a close relative marries a Muslim is around 50%, while for all the other groups, Asian, West Indian, Black African, Eastern European, it's more like 20% or perhaps 25%. So the people who mind in relation to Muslims are twice as many amongst white British people. Now, you might say, well, yes, this is about marriage. Marriage is obviously a pretty exceptional relationship that people have. You know, we're not married to a lot of people, certainly not at any one time. But nevertheless, if you think about it, this is a tip of an iceberg, because attitudes to marriage will also be reflected in attitudes to dating, friendship, social circles more generally. And therefore, you know, who you know, how many Muslims you know or don't know will be a basis for ignorance or knowing only a very narrow range of Muslims, and therefore a social basis for the construction and dissemination of stereotypes about Muslims. Moreover, the people that we know are important to us in all kinds of ways, helping us at various times, including, of course, telling us about job vacancies or helping us to find employment. These networks, sometimes referred to as social capital, are quite significant. And if Muslims are underrepresented in the networks of white and, in fact, other minority peoples, then that will clearly have an implication for their social chances, their chances, for example, in getting employment. And in fact, let us turn to employment. In 2017, I worked with the BBC in a program, perhaps some of you saw it, called Inside Out. What we did in this program was we did what's technically called a discrimination test. What we did was we created 100 applications for vacancies that we'd identified. These were real vacancies that we saw in the media, online job platforms, and so on. And they were all for a similar range of jobs. They were for kind of middle manager positions in IT. And we identified 100 vacancies, and we sent applications to them. We sent 2 applications to each vacancy. And the applications were identical, more or less identical, except for one crucial difference: the name on the application form. In one of the 2, it was Adam. In the other, it was Mohammed. And then we waited to see what response we got. Adam was invited to 12 job interviews, and Mohammed was invited to 4 job interviews. Obviously, some kind of discrimination was at work. That was exactly the purpose of the test. But the real significance for me was not the fact of discrimination in the jobs market. And I should say this was in London and the Southeast. Because actually, we know that such discrimination exists. Over the years, this kind of experiment has been done a number of times with ethnic minority names and white names. And the usual result is that the ethnic minority applicant gets 1/3 less invitations to the next stage of the selection process. Sometimes a little less, but around 1/3. But look at the proportion here. Mohammed got 2/3 less than Adam. And this is in a diverse global city like London. You know, if it's like that in London, we can expect higher again in a provincial town. And the underlying point here is what we got in the jobs market is actually what the British social attitudes found in relation to the marriage question. Namely, that a Muslim name suffered a disadvantage, a discrimination, at twice the rate that in other studies, ethnic minority names have suffered. So the first thing to note about Islamophobia is that it's not the case that it's the same size as other forms of ethnic or religious minority discrimination or prejudice. It is twice as big. So I'll turn now to the second problem. So that's our first problem. The second problem is that despite its scale, there is in British society, including in politics, I'll just concentrate on politics in this slide, there is large-scale denial and marginality about the problem and how to deal with it. We know famously the Prime Minister spoke of women who wear the niqab as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. That was some years ago and before he was Prime Minister. But despite being pressed on it, he has refused to apologize to this day. The Conservative Party has a whole stream of complaints from its own members, including councillors and members of parliament, elected Muslim members of parliament who are conservatives, that they have suffered discrimination or harassment, and the Conservative Party has been very slow to do anything about it. Boris Johnson was bounced through, in fact, the leadership campaign when Sajid Javid said he would carry out an inquiry into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson was bounced into saying he would do the same. And indeed, he did belatedly carry out an inquiry. But to this date, no action, even though the inquiry found that there was some discrimination, though I think it actually understated the problem in the way that it conducted the inquiry. No action of any kind has been proposed by the Conservative Party in relation to the Islamophobia in its ranks. The Labour Party also has not carried out a real systematic inquiry or a programme of action. If you compare what the Labour Party has done in relation to anti-Semitism, you see the scale of denial and marginality about Islamophobia in the Labour Party. The all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims actually came up with a definition of Islamophobia, and I'll turn to aspects of that later. But the point I want to make here is that the government rejected the definition, even though many other people have accepted it, including Bristol University. The government has rejected the definition, but hasn't come up with an alternative, let alone any kind of program of anti-discrimination action. You may have heard of the IHRA definition. That's the definition on anti-Semitism that the university has accepted. The government has accepted that and has promoted it with great pressure, including upon universities, which is another point of contrast with its lack of action on Islamophobia. And finally, on the slide, I have the Sewell report. The Sewell report was a government commissioned report on racism in Britain, published just some months ago. And there are many things actually wrong with the report, and they've been highlighted in the media, both the mass media and the social media and so on. But what's interesting is that there isn't a single reference to Islamophobia in the Sewell report on racism. And that's not really something the media has commented on either, though it has commented on many other failings of the report. What about the University of Bristol? Do we give Islamophobia twice the attention we give to other racisms? No, we do not. Do we give it the same attention as we do to other racisms? No, we do not. At the moment, the University of Bristol, Bristol City, and indeed the country as a whole is, of course, very activated by the anti-racism associated with the Black Lives Matter, especially, following the horrific murder of George Floyd that we all know about. And I understand how not everything can be all done at the same time, and that there are certain critical moments, what we might call pregnant moments, when some actions on some front are possible and can be achieved and not on other fronts. My hope is that in due course, that Islamophobia too will come to be given the kind of priority that other racisms, in particular anti-Black racism, is given at the moment by the university and, as I say, the government and the country as a whole. That takes us, in fact, to the third problem. And the third problem is the fact that some people don't think Islamophobia is indeed a form of racism. So how can it merit the priority that we should give to anti-racism? For a lot of people, Islamophobia is a religious prejudice, and the response to religious prejudice should be tolerance. They say Muslims are not a racial group, so there's no such thing as anti-Muslim racism. And Muslims should be tolerated, of course, they say, but Muslims should not be expected to be part of racial equality laws and policies, whether that be at a governmental level or at an employer level, university level, and so on. Some people still hold that view, but I think it is not now the majority views, certainly not in sociology and social research, and not really, I think, in public policy, except in relation to the Conservative Party and the government. The first time a public document, public policy document, in fact, more or less, it didn't coin the term Islamophobia, but gave it a popular basis, a recognition, a public recognition, was in 1997 by the Runnymede Trust. And they defined it as the dread or fear of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. I've always thought that this is not enough. It brings us close to racism. And in fact, more recently, the Runnymede Trust has defined Islamophobia, racism, but it took it quite a long time to do so. And I've always thought we should understand Islamophobia as a form of racism. So let me explain why I think it's a form of racism. The first thing is that we must recognize the letter S at the end of the title of this slide, racisms. There isn't one racism. There are different forms of racism. Of course, the one that we are most familiar with, both today and historically, especially for a country like Britain, is what we might call color racism. The racism by white people against people of what we might call other color, i.e. people who are not white. And above all, against people of African descent in what we might call the Atlantic area. You know, on both sides of the Atlantic, on the European and African side, and on the Caribbean and the American continental side. So above all, it's anti-Black racism, but it can also be anti-brown racism. It can be anti-Native American racism. It can be, which is sometimes, because you know, American Indians were sometimes called red. So that also is a form of color racism. It can be anti-Chinese racism, because Chinese are sometimes called yellow, historically have been, and so on. But there are other racisms which have nothing specific or only to do with color or physical appearance. Take anti-Semitism. So this is a racism against a group of people who are a historic religious community, or what we might call a ethnic or ethno-religious community of, you know, long-standing historical standing and long-standing racism. That's not the only one. Paki bashing is a form of racism. You can have anti-Asian racism. Not can have, there is anti-Asian racism in Britain, as indeed there's also anti-Arab racism. So these are all examples of what I mean when I say that the letter S in racisms is vital. I also mention here an example of Bosnian Muslims. So here's the first example of Muslims, because those people who say, well, Muslims are just a religious group and they didn't suffer racism. Well, actually, what we call ethnic cleansing is a most direct and indeed genocidal form of racism. It wasn't just about religious intolerance. The Serbs who were ethnic cleansing certain parts of Bosnia of Muslims weren't interested in any degree of religiosity. They didn't turn up like the Spanish Inquisition and ask people, what do you believe? They identified Muslims in terms of ethnic descent, just like Jews are identified in terms of ethnic descent, or indeed, I mentioned people of African descent, Arab descent, and so on. And so that means that the heart of racism is not genetics, but a form of this descent, which can be cultural or communal So of course, it can also be based on physical appearance, what technically we talk about as phenotype, and what I've referred to here as color racism. But my point is that it doesn't have to be, it can go beyond that, and actually does go beyond that in contemporary Britain. And therefore it becomes what we might call, what I do call, cultural racism, because it combines a cultural portrayal of the target group as well as a physical racialized descent aspect of the target group. And I think, though this isn't perhaps true of the United States, but if we look at Western Europe, including Britain, I think that cultural racism is the most common form of racism today, more so than old-fashioned color racisms. Let me explain that a bit more. So in sociology, we talk about racialization. We talk about how races are constructed, because we don't just think races are a biological given. Even biologists deny that races exist as biological categories. There is social construction in the context of social relations, typically domination, or if you like, domination and subordination. There's a dominant race that racializes another group of people and therefore creates them as a race. So then when white Europeans went to West Africa for the first time in the 15th century onwards, they said, oh, you are a race, you are all black people, which was news to the people who lived there at the time. They didn't know they were a race. They didn't know they were a single race. They didn't know they were black. So I think we can think of racialization, of course, in terms of phenotype or color. Indeed, we must. But I call that the ground floor of racism. It's not the full extent of the building. Rather, especially today, but also in other times in history, and in the case of anti-Semitism, perhaps always, culture, community, and religion is built on phenotypical identifications, and they become the upper floor. And the two together, the ground floor and the upper floor, constituting what I referred to as cultural racism. And so what racialization is, what a race is the creation of an other. It's not a biological category. It's the creation of an other. And it can be a creation that's more physical in its emphasis, or more cultural in its emphasis, including religious, or both. And one of the core features of this othering and racialization is that it uses what sociologists and people have called an essentialism. It says that this other group, Black people, Chinese, Muslims, whatever they are, this other group can be generalized about because they have a single essence. They're all the same, or if not all, they're mostly the same. Like stereotypes about Black people lacking intelligence, stereotypes about Muslims being fanatics or terrorists or misogynists, and so on. So that's my understanding of racism. It's not a form of biological determinism. Insofar as there's determinism, it's actually attributed to people's culture and religion, or community and upbringing, rather than to genetics. I turn now to my last problem, because having identified that Islamophobia is a form of racism, we must then think, well, how and when can we talk about Muslims and Islam critically without being racist? As indeed we must be able to do so. We must be able to talk about any group without necessarily being racist. So I then have tried to sketch out the difference between Islamophobia and what we might call reasonable criticism of Muslims and Islam. And I illustrate that here by using a proposition, a view that quite a lot of people hold about Muslims, about British Muslims. The proposition is, in quote marks on the slide, Muslim views about women are oppressive and not appropriate for modern Britain. So my question is this Islamophobia or reasonable criticism? And my answer is that just by looking at it, or just by knowing that someone said it, you can't answer the question whether it's Islamophobia or reasonable criticism. You have to look at the context and how that proposition is used, how it is deployed. And to do that, I suggest 5 tests which allow us to do that. Very, very briefly, here are the 5 tests. Does it stereotype Muslims by assuming they all think the same, which I've just argued is a feature of racialization and of othering? Does it do that? Because if it does, well, yes, it will be Islamophobia. Secondly, is it about Muslims, a generalization from the outside, which can be a form of othering, or is it a dialogue with Muslims, which they would wish to join in? And dialogue, I think, is actually the central point that runs across my 5 tests. Thirdly, is mutual learning possible? Because if criticism is all one way, then we're likely to begin to get towards Islamophobia, because it's just the development of a critical to a very critical to a totally unsympathetic to a hostile attitude. How we prevent sliding into hostility is by saying there must be a two-way dialogue. There must be mutual learning. And I've given some examples here. I won't go into all of them. I don't have time. Just mention one. So Muslims have argued, continue to argue about British society, that it's over-sexualized. For a long time, people thought, well, this is just a form of Puritan social conservatism. But actually, if we look at the last few years, the last decade or so, the idea that society, including workplaces, consists of over-sexualized uses of power and subordination, men over women, is actually now regarded as a commonplace. And of course, it crystallized in the Me Too movement and has gone on in all kinds of different ways, including, for instance, scrutiny about how the police treat women and how police treat the concerns of women and the reports about harassment and so on, of violence that women might make to the police. I said there were 5 tests, so that means there are 2 left. Here they are. Is the language civil and contextually appropriate? And I offer here an example which isn't just about Islamophobia, so that one can see that there are parallels with, of course, other forms of racism and so on. I think it's perfectly possible to offer radical criticism of Zionism without it being anti-Semitic. And this is, of course, one of the fundamental flaws of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that the university has adopted, that the government has adopted, that it doesn't allow radical criticism of Zionism, because it says if you single Israel out for criticism, you're somehow being anti-Semitic. And I think that's false. And I would say exactly the same about Islamophobia. You can single Muslims out for criticism without being Islamophobic, as long as the criticism is civil, contextually appropriate, and above all, is dialogical. That you're engaging in a dialogue, not just trying to put someone down, not just trying to other them. And my last test is insincere criticism for ulterior motives. I think that actually can be very common. An example is actually support for Israel. 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, most people who we think of as racist and fascist, extreme right and populist groups in Britain, as well as in other countries in Europe and the United States, were well known for their anti-Semitism. In fact, anti-Semitism was often regarded as their core racism, especially in continental Europe. But now these groups have suddenly become strong supporters of Israel. They carry the Star of David flag at demonstrations in the United States, for instance. And now they say they are pro-Jews and pro-Israel. And one of the criticisms they want to make of Muslims, they say, is Muslims are anti-Semitic. Well, it doesn't take much to see that that's not really a sincere conversion by racists and fascists. They're just looking for a stick to beat Muslims with, and they've found one in Israel and Jews. And I make another comparison to the way how some right-wing people, right-wing media like the Daily Mail and the Telegraph have suddenly become advocates of gender equality and feminism, but only when they're talking about Muslims, because they say, oh, Muslims, they don't live up to British standards of gender equality, standards which the Daily Mail itself used to call un-British only a couple of decades ago. So those are my 4 problems, and I'll just sum them up by going back to the first slide and reminding you of what I have said. So here is the slide. So my question was, first one, does it exist and how big is it? And my answer is, it's roughly twice, Islamophobia is roughly twice that experienced by other non-white minorities in Britain. What is it? My answer is, it's a form of cultural racism. About denial and marginality, I say yes, it is very much denied and not taken seriously by the right, but actually by mainstream institutions neither. And finally, can it be distinguished from reasonable criticism? Yes, it can, but it's very contextual. The distinguishing is very contextual. And it may not be the case that if we accept the concept of Islamophobia, that everything that's said about Muslims is Islamophobic. I agree that would be an absurd criticism. So any definition, an absurd conclusion. So any definition of Islamophobia that leads us to that conclusion must be flawed. But I've shown how my definition of Islamophobia as cultural racism does not lead to that conclusion, because it creates space for reasonable criticism through those 5 tests and the central idea of dialogical criticism as opposed to one-way othering and racialization. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Lauren to to lead the question and answer session, to chair the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tariq Modood. That was a really, really interesting talk, and those last bits about the 5 tests, and especially about that running theme of dialogue being really important. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you.